Yes, President Edgar Chagwa Lungu's death is a big blow to the nation, and a big blow to the party, and at individual level, I have lost a big brother. I've lost a mentor. Indeed, it's a very big loss. I remember the early days when I met President Lungu, before I even went to Parliament. I was a board chairperson for Energy Regulation Board. I have never seen a man so humble. The levels of humility that made me feel so comfortable in his presence as we discussed the energy sector and many other issues that affected the petroleum and electricity subsectors. When I became a member of Parliament and appointed minister, I was again amazed at how this very intelligent man displayed the highest levels of leadership as he guided us through. I was a minister for the first time. I was in Parliament for the first time. I got a lot of guidance from him. One of the things that I remember clearly, he encouraged me as minister not to be afraid to make mistakes. He said, "My minister, you should make your decisions. Ngamapanga mistake or rectify, will help you to rectify those mistakes. Nishinomba mwaishpo kuti mwayamule kula mulibu minister then." Yeah, so even as we mourn him, I reflect upon those moments and how he supported Northern Province in many aspects. I remember in 2018, I called a day before to secure an appointment to go and see him. I got into his office and I told him, "Your Excellency, I came to consult and also seek for support. We had an upcoming investment expo in Northern Province." Then I told him that there is one gentleman of British origin who had been to my office, who told me about the end of World War I. And he asked me whether I had enough courage to rewrite or help rewrite the world history by informing the world that World War I actually ended in Zambia and not in Europe as was earlier reported. So I told the president I was there to see him, to seek for support, because this was a mission impossible, so to speak, but I was ready to take up the challenge. And indeed, his response was, normally you would speak in Bemba, a minister. Do you know what that is? You are basically seeking to rewrite world history. Are you sure the British will accept that narrative? And I assured him, I said I was ready to take a chance. He laughed and said, "Anyway, you've got to try these things." Fast forward, he supported me through cabinet, and we had a very, very successful event in Imbala and Kasama on the 20th of November 2018. President Lungu toured Northern Province on a number of occasions. I picked from the discussions that we'd have that he was very passionate about the disadvantaged in society, the less privileged, the poor people. Anything that had to do with the poor and the less privileged, he paid specific attention to it. And many a time, he gave very strict directives to ensure that those challenges were resolved. Among those were things to do with agriculture, distribution of farming inputs. He was very strict about when and the quantum of support that individual farmers were getting from government. He was very passionate about issues to do with health. So some of the projects that he encouraged us to do had to do with universal health coverage, and ensured that we lived up to the PF manifesto, which was to have a health facility within 10 kilometers of every settlement. He also took a lot of interest in the feeder road projects. he always said to us that the moment you have feeder roads worked on within the province, it was easy to sustain and maintain the young professionals who were working as nurses and teachers, because like their friends in urban areas, they could also get loans, car loans, and be able to drive themselves to to town for shopping and so on. He said from these feeder roads, the farmers will benefit to get their inputs and indeed deliver their produce to the markets. So we were able to deliver to the people of Northern Province with the support of President Lungu. And he remained steadfast. He remained committed to the pro-poor policies, that were contained in the manifesto. If you go to Kasama and ask the level at which President Lungu interacted with citizens generally, his usual, his traditional morning jog, as long as he's sleeping there in the morning, he woke all of us up, and we were running on the street. And during that time, he could slow down and speak to, citizens who were just walking or running alongside. So he indeed instilled one value in all of us that served under him. Because you can imagine that if, as a minister, I wanted to act in a particular way, people could simply look at how the president was treating them as ordinary citizens. So it compelled even those of us that may have wanted to have a certain attitude towards ordinary people to adjust accordingly. Because the president himself, the number one citizen and employer, could descend to the levels of marketeers at Chikumanino Market and be able to interact with them comfortably. And I think to crown it all, I remember going to Chilubi. We all thought we were going and coming back into Kasama. So we landed in Chilubi that afternoon. And I think around 17, the pilots began to panic and they were going to consult him that we needed to take off because Kasama Airport didn't have very good lighting. I remember him turning to Achande and saying, "Tulea kwisa, tulea kuno kwine." Oh my goodness. It was a lodge where, even for us as ministers, we would never sleep. We just used to go in and out. The president said, "Tulea kuno kwine." Everyone was concerned. They said, "But you can't." He says, and for sure, whoever was on that trip will tell you, we were all very humbled because the president told the DC and the MP to make arrangements for all of us to spend the night there. So I'm describing a man who was so humble and ruled this country with passion. He ruled this country with distinction. If you don't spend time, those that never spent time with him would actually not even discern or discover how intelligent President Lungu was. One, he was very patient. He literally could lend you his ear. You speak all you want, and very few comments you would actually pick his mind. You would actually realize that he's a well-informed man. Not only was he a lawyer, but he was very informed, politically and otherwise. Yeah, so I continue to miss him. I enjoyed a very good relationship with him. If I picked my phone and opened, showed you President Lungu's number, we chatted most of the evenings, and he was very good with his phones. So he would sometimes just greet you and send a joke. You respond and you started chatting away. He had a lot of time for all of us. I'm not the only one that would chat with that much in the evenings, because I speak to my friends and he chatted with a lot of us. That's how come he came to learn about a number of things that were happening. And his relationships with traditional leaders. He knew chiefs right across the country. By name, he had their numbers and kept in contact. He would actually, I remember, he would talk about maybe chiefs in Western Province when I was telling him about my experience in Western Province. And sometimes you'd quickly pick up the phone, oh, Kale, I spoke to him 2 weeks ago, Kambapo Sheko. Yeah, so this is the man that we are talking about. He challenged all of us in the way that he found time to interact with people. I've talked about traditional leaders. I have talked about even just artists. You would listen to a song and say, come to me. Phone. This is somebody maybe I know. I don't even have that person's number, but President Lungu has their number, and you would call them. You would then realize how much he related with people across this society. Indeed, he was a great man. President Lungu was a great man, and we all remember him. I remember him as his MP, having been his minister, having been his government chief whip, and indeed leader of opposition. I want to believe that Zambians, for instance, if we pick Lusaka, we will never forget President Lungu. Many motorists remember him because he managed to resolve the traffic congestions that had started developing from around 2015-2016 with the construction of these 3 flyover bridges. Is it 3 or 4 flyover bridges? And the bypass from Chilanga all the way, they call it the 7070. People remember him and his passion for tourism. He was not only talking about the potential that Zambia had in the tourism sector, he took practical steps and ensured that we had 3 modern airports, Kenneth Kaunda International, Harimwanga Nkumbula, and Simon Kapwepwe. These will always be there, and we'll remember President Lungu and his passion for tourism. He was even going further. He began to look at aerodromes and airstrips so that the bigger carriers, for instance, landed at Lusaka, Kasama Airport, Solwezi, and all these other areas. And then the small aircrafts could also land near these tourism assets that we had. If you look at his record in the agriculture sector, yes, during the MMD time, I think production was around 2.8 million tons. President Sata came in, production started increasing. With President Lungu, he was very consistent. The yield was between 3.5 and 3.6 million tons consistently, including the year that we had COVID and even the election year. He understood that food security was very important to this country, and he was very committed, to ensure that farmers were fully supported. I think many of us remember that, let's take the election year, for instance. Elections were coming in August. You can imagine that by July, the whole country had all the farming inputs supplied. Wow. Look at the COVID period. Logistics during that time were very, very difficult. But if you go to the record, you will realize that President Lungu ensured that the farmers got their farming inputs in the sheds right across the country, as it were. And the health sector that I talked about, besides the 650 health posts across the country, there were a number of district hospitals and a number of mini hospitals. He wouldn't just stop. He made sure that he tried to get to what was in the party manifesto, which was to have a health facility within 10 kilometers of every settlement to achieve the universal health coverage. President Lungu didn't stop there. He would talk about medicines and said, let's make sure that we just don't build these hospitals. We should make sure that they are well supplied with medicines. If you go to medical stores then, which is ZAMSA, they actually, they have a system, at least the time we're in government, they had a system that used to monitor stock levels right across the country. So they didn't need to wait for Mporokoso General Hospital to put in a requisition. Through the usage of these drugs, there were messages automatically kicked into medical stores, and medical stores began to mobilize and assemble stocks to deliver to these hospitals. That is why consistently through President Edgar Chagwa's reign, medicines were sufficient in hospitals. They were always over 75%. Because one, he made sure that medical stores was fully supported, and he made sure that these systems were running at all times. When you talk about youths, for instance, he always said, "Imiti kula empanga." If we don't look after the youths, that was him telling us, if we don't look after the youths, we're going to have a problem, because these same people will not be able to contribute anything to this society, but they'll also become rebels. They'll become rebels and rebel against us. They'll become vandals. They'll vandalize anything that they find along the way. So in as much as we are constructing the country, can we also look at the youth welfare? Many would not even know that when Professor Luo was Minister of Higher Education, President Lungu, working together with the minister, came up with what was called the Skills Fund. Through this fund, this was a fund that was taxed on companies, and they collected in a pool that helped to fund not universities, not colleges, but trade schools, so that the youths in various areas who were disadvantaged could acquire some skills. For instance, if you had youths who were interested in woodworks, through the Skills Fund, Ministry of Higher Education procured woodworking equipment and trained these youths on this woodworking equipment. When they finished their training, the ministry actually bought equipment for them, similar to what they were using to go and start up. This happened with woodworking equipment. It also happened with steel fabrication and many other, small scale businesses, because President Lungu cared about the youths. He also realized that many of our youths were found in bus stations. They acquired some experience in that particular business. They worked for others to handle luggage, sell tickets, and so on. He was able to start a youth program for youth empowerment, for youths to own buses. It was a very good program where government guaranteed to the supply of buses. These buses were given to youth groups, and along the way, the youths were repaying to the bus suppliers. And after repayment, the youths were to own these buses. He extended that to fuel tankers, as it were, a program that I believe is still running today, but it's not running according to the author of that program. We've seen that our friends in the UPND have taken it differently. They grabbed the tankers from the youths who initially benefited from them. Even after they increased the number of tankers, they procured more to cater for their youths. They disadvantaged the youths from the PF. And ultimately, I think the youths are not even benefiting from those tankers. The stories that we hear today are that it's the ministers who are actually benefiting from these youths. President Lungu must be turning in his grave, because that tanker empowerment program was meant to help the youths, become entrepreneurs, grow into big transporters, transporting petroleum products right across the country, as it were. Yeah, so I can go on and on. My experiences with President Lungu are many. All I can say is that for the party, I think in trying to remember, in memory of President Lungu, we have all agreed that we will remain united, because that was what President Lungu stood for. Talking to other opposition political leaders, they are also of the same view, that President Lungu stood for unity. President Lungu stood for love and tolerance. These are some of the values that we want to hold on to very dearly as we navigate through this political journey. Yeah, the party leadership under President Lungu, President Luwinda is acting president, Nagachinda is the Secretary General, they've done a very good job in holding all the members together through this very difficult journey. They started taking care of the party before the demise of the president. They've continued to look after the party even after the demise of the president. And just the unity that the party has shown the past 3 weeks only goes to point to one thing, that we are all ready to remain united. We are ready to be guided by the party leadership, how we transition going forward. And everybody, we are all consulting one another. At Parliament, you can see we're all working together. You know, some people are amazed. One person called me yesterday. They saw me with Mao Sampa, they saw me with Kafuaya, we were with Chilufya. And they were saying, look, we didn't expect this. We are assuring Zambians, I want to assure Zambians that we have made one resolution in honor or in memory of President Lungu. We shall remain united. Yeah, the tolerance levels, now that President Lungu is gone, our tolerance levels at personal level have been enlarged because we have to emulate the spirit that President Lungu had. President Lungu, like any other person, showed that forgiveness is divine. He had differed with some of the people at political level, but we saw how he swiftly moved in, and we found them having tea together, having a drink together, and jogging. So who are we if our former president, our father, our mentor, our big brother could do that? We can only follow suit. We also want to make this undertaking to the people of Zambia that going forward, we've all agreed that should the Zambian people give us a chance to govern this country again after 2026, we'll go back to the drawing board. What President Lungu showed us in 2015, we all remember when somebody asked him what his vision was, and he said he had no vision. People started mocking him and talking about that. But what he actually meant was that, look, I'm taking over President Michael Sata's reign. It would be unfair for me to abandon what the father of this party, President Sata, had lined up for this country, policies that we all supported. So it was not a question of having a vision that departed from the already established vision that President Sata had. And there it is. He spoke less. That's a man that has delivered development to this country. The levels, the development that President Lungu delivered to this country will remain unmatched for a very long time. As President Lungu lies there, Zambians know that this is the man who improved the electricity generation in this country and moved it from 1,600 megawatts, where it had been for over 50 years, and increased it by another 2,000 megawatts. That's President Edgar Chagwa Lungu. I already talked about the tourism sector, the construction of the 3 airports. The people of Southern Province will never forget President Lungu. When they look at the Kazungula Bridge, they remember that there once was a president, President Wawonse, President for all, President Lungu, who took development even to areas where he received less support. President Lungu did not choose where he delivered development. Kazungula Bridge was well over $200 million. He didn't say, Kunj senda kwama votes, we can't take this development there. He didn't mind. He always talked about Zambia. He said, never president, I'm a president for all. We see Kazungula Bridge. You go to Western Province, you are going to find the Mongo Kalavo Road. That's the most expensive physical project in this part of Africa. And President Lungu and President Sata simply say, the people of Mongo are our people, we love them, and deliver that bridge. The Sioma Bridge in Western Province. When you come to Solwezi, you're going to find the Chingola Solwezi Road. President Lungu told us, as provincial ministers, when we were trying to lobby for some development in our respective provinces, President Lungu simply said, this is about Zambia. Rane the resource envelope is limited. We are prioritizing areas that are going to increase local resource mobilization. So Ishomise Omulela Ndapo Festival Loleleni, let's do the Chingola Solwezi Road, because Solwezi was an upcoming copper belt, and he said, let's facilitate the movement of minerals and mineral produce from northwestern province into the export markets. He didn't stop there. He also looked at the Tanpak Mazabuka Road. Okay, Mazabuka was not a PF stronghold. President Lungu didn't get a lot of votes out of the southern province, but he decided that road, I think, was about $35 million, Tanpak Mazabuka Road, so that the copper from Solwezi came into Chingola. He also worked on the Chingola-Kitwe Road, and thereafter, when the copper was passed through Saka, it could easily get into Botswana and Zimbabwe as it were. The most important thing to remember there is that President Lungu was very, very serious about development. I already talked about the health posts, the mini hospitals, the district hospitals. Now we are talking about bridges, as it were. President Lungu was, as I said, very concerned about development in rural areas. The policies under the PF and under President Lungu were pro-poor. He planted over 2,000 towers countrywide. There are very few constituencies today that will say they have no network completely, because President Lungu and President Sata believed in one thing. They believed that even a person in Sunkutu area in Mporokoso, where there was just one phone belonging to the headmaster, they took a tower there. They did not look at the business side as others would do. They did not say there will be no money made. Through Zamtel, they delivered a very expensive tower there and believed that the phones will come later. Even if the phones came later and didn't make a commercial sense, but at least when a life of a mother who's in the family way is threatened, that one headmaster could make a call to Mpolokoso District Hospital for an ambulance to go and get that particular mother, and a life was saved. That was a belief of President Lungu. He said, it's not about Zamtel making money. You can't put a value to life. And this is what we saw. We saw this in far-flung areas. I would go to Mumba in Mungwi district. I'll go to Chisari area in Mungwi district and find communication towers there. I'll go to Nseluka, I'll go to Kayambi and go and find communication towers there. Because President Lungu believed the Zambians that lived there were not different from the Zambians in Kitwe and Lusaka. And this is what is very humbling about this man. And for sure, when you had problems in those areas, people would pick up the phone and call. We've got patients, we've got that challenge, and so on and so forth. So there were 2,000 communication towers erected right across the country. President Lungu also started the rural electrification program. And I'm glad to announce today that a number of rural areas received their fair share of rural electrification. In that many a time people talk about green policies, but they had no practical approaches to how they were going to resolve, for instance, or improve on the green environment. So what President Lungu did was to embark on a program for rural electrification. We have seen that in most parts of the country, because these parts of the country are now connected to the main grid, there's been some considerable reduction in charcoal burning, and the forests in those particular areas were reserved. Yeah, so in sum, we are looking at a man who was very practical. President Lungu avoided rhetoric. He spoke less and acted more. Some of the things I'm talking about now, people didn't even know. You can imagine if it were other leaders today, what they would be saying about the energy sector. if under their watch they increased power generation by another 2,000 megawatts, the things we've been hearing is for the first time, I'm the first one. And President Lungu never said that, and yet it remains a fact. Can you imagine what would happen if other leaders were the ones that under their watch, Kenneth Kaunda International Airport was constructed, then Ndola Airport and the Livingston Airport. Look at what I've done. Look at what I've done. You know, pali Kazungula Bridge, pali ngatatula lotulo. Mama na Kazungula Bridge. A long time ago, people were crossing on pontoons. Look at what I've done. Mongu Kalavo, ngakwa have a problem. You know, Chingola Solwezi ngapali wo wafia. But President Lungu would just smile and say, look, I'm a president, I need to do this. 650 health posts. Ngakuba nowhere else. Ngakwa you know if you say, yo, President of Angola are calling me to find out how I did this in the health sector. I should go and advise them. You know, President Lungu was very sincere. He had no time to tell lies. He only had time to deliver development, as it were. So today's leaders must learn one thing. Even those that, for the time that he was president, never recognized him. I remember one leader would even say, there's no law that compels me to recognize anybody. But today, the same leaders are up in arms and say, no, he was our president. Yeah, so we must be very, very careful and learn. Let's appreciate good people when they are alive. Let's all learn one thing from President Lungu's death. Let's appreciate good people when they are alive. It costs nothing. Imagine today we are highlighting the profile of President Lungu. Many Zambians, the time he was in power, because of the propaganda, because of the many stories, actually thought President Lungu was corrupt. It was until after 2021 that many people began to realize and look at the actual corruption. Today we are talking about Mopani, for instance. Vasenda Femain, Ivaya Mumunga ka company, ato kuli company, inea Mopani nomba, na Mopani vaiva vasenda. President Lungu would never do that. President Lungu got Mopani and put it under the SSMIH. It was 100% owned by Zambians. For everyone said Mopani, yes. He did it for the good of the Zambians. President Lungu never went behind to form a company in Abu Dhabi and later on come and they open a tender which was already closed. And miraculously, this new company, which was registered yesterday, was the one to win this particular tender. President Lungu wouldn't do that. But today, this is what we are seeing. And yet, people called him corrupt. Today, after President Lungu improves power generation by an extra 2,000 megawatts, we have seen companies coming up. They are calling them, they are calling it power trading, you know, and so on, where ZESCO puts up 100 megawatts of solar power in Chisamba. Now, the mines are to consume most of this power from Chisamba, from this solar plant. But our leaders today introduce another company to buy this power from this solar plant and export it to the mining houses. But what they do, the power they're exporting is not the power from the solar. The power from the solar goes into ZESCO. So they are now getting 100 megawatts from ZESCO to sell to the mines. Effectively what they are doing, knowing that the solar technology, the frequency varies. So even if the installed capacity is 100 megawatts, maybe the actual production, the output, will be between 70 and 80. But they're talking about 100 megawatts. They commit 100 megawatts to this middleman. But this middleman is not getting power from the solar plant. They are getting from ZESCO, so that the 100 megawatts is guaranteed to the mine, knowing very well that the solar plant would deliver less than 100 megawatts. President Lungu never used middlemen, to make money for himself. President Lungu understood that corruption did not only involve the giving and receiving of bribes, but it involved all the decisions that were made in private interest at the expense of public interest. And this involved policies, administration, and indeed legislation. President Lungu knew that when you are corrupt, you can even come up with a policy and call it government policy, yet that policy is to facilitate corruption. You would bring laws, enact laws. Those laws may be under Ministry of Finance to do with securities. And later we see unfair takeovers of companies like Madison and many others. President Lungu knew that this would still be called corruption. That's why he made sure that the policies should indeed be above board. Because he also knew, President Lungu knew, that when as a leader you abandon public good or that which is good for the public, then immediately you do that, politics ceases to be a vocation. It now becomes a trade where promises are traded for votes. Okay? And when those votes come, they in turn give you influence to manipulate national assets for personal aggrandizement. President Lungu knew that this was indeed, this is a corruption. So if ZESCO is importing power, ZESCO should import power directly so that it's not doing that through a middleman who adds a markup, which markup is to be paid for by the poor Zambians downstream. We have situations today where Ministry of Energy would come to Parliament and ask for an approval of an emergency tariff hike so that they can import power and give power to the citizens, the barbershops to run, and so on and so forth. President Lungu wouldn't do that. And later, it turns out that the margin they were trying to create was simply to allow the middlemen to make money, as it were. President Lungu didn't do such deals. Today, every transaction at government level has a middleman. You go to the Ndola dual carriageway, you're going to find a consortium. When you ask a question, what is this consortium doing? This consortium is just jumping on a yango. They go to NAPSA on a yango, they borrow some money, another yango, they go to workman's compensation, and then they bring in contractors and they start making the road. Then you ask a question to say, President Lungu would ask, he would say to us today in his grave, countrymen and women, the Chingola Solwezi Road was constructed using a tripartite arrangement of the National Road Fund Agency, NAPSA, and the contractors. The money came from NAPSA to fund the roads. And then National Road Fund Agency created toll gates along those roads, collected money, and paid NAPSA. So President Lungu will be wondering in his grave to say, what is this Ndola dual carriageway? How have you changed from the tripartite arrangement that we already had? That's the arrangement that built the Chingola Solwezi Road. That's the arrangement that built the Kitwe Chingola Road. There was no consortium. There was no middleman. It was National Road Fund Agency, the contractors, NAPSA, workman's compensation. Today, President Lungu will be saying to us that the Ndola dual carriageway would be much cheaper if National Road Fund Agency just got the money, got Avic and China Railway as contractors to construct the road at $700 million. Then they put up toll gates. National Road Fund Agency would still continue collecting toll gates today as they did. And they continue paying the interim payment certificates coming from these contractors. Simple. There was not going to be a concession for 25 years because the concessionaire did not demonstrate capacity to mobilize funds. The funds were already sitting here. Patrick, somebody comes to you and says, your son has 3 million kwacha. Your son, the one that you're living with. And therefore, I am Congolese, that 3 million from your son, and then that house will be in my name for 25 years. That's what is happening. That's what is happening. President Lungu wouldn't tolerate this form of corruption. The corruption the American ambassador talked about, where you're given money to buy maize and be able to give food to your people. The maize never comes. Money is spent somewhere. God knows where the money is. And the people that are handling that particular transaction are jumping and diving, playing games to wait for the next maize farming harvest season to come. And then they'll tell you that the maize came. And President Lungu would actually be very surprised. Because when this issue came up, nobody talked about the maize having arrived. But the moment people started harvesting maize, then they said, no, the maize actually came. Because if you challenge them, they'll take you and show you fresh maize. And this is pure theft, which President Lungu did not tolerate. I've gone to that extent because there was a lot of propaganda. A lot of propaganda that was talking about PF Nwakavolala. Today, we know who the real thieves are. Go back to the FIC reports. The highest figure that was reported to be that of questionable transactions under the FIC report during the PF, the highest figure was 2 billion kwacha. Today, in the 3 years of the UPND, we've had 13.5 billion kwacha, we've had 5.8 billion kwacha, we've had 60 billion kwacha, and we've had $3 billion. So I want to know, President Lungu and all of us who are his ministers were called thieves because the FIC report showed 2 billion kwacha. The FIC reports today have shown 60 billion kwacha, 13 billion kwacha, 5 billion kwacha, and $3 billion. I wonder who today can stand up and call Edgar Lungu's government to be a government of thieves. If they did, because of misadventure, what would they then call the UPND government with everything else that is going on today? What would they call the UPND today if they called President Lungu's government a government of thieves with what happened at Mopani? Even a little child can see through what happened at Mopani. Everybody can see what happened on the dual carriageway. President Lungu's procurement systems for medicines were very clear and transparent. Under the current government, we've got an obscure system for procurement of medicines. Zambians must take interest because President Lungu must be speaking to us to say, look at the transaction that resulted in that the wastage of 61 containers of medicines. Many people would look at that issue at the tail end. But I know my big brother should be saying, no, go deeper. How was that procurement done? How was the procurement done? People were leaving Zambia with cash, okay? Getting approvals from Attorney General's office to be able to handle cash and go into Egypt to deal with companies, talking to the likes of Zamsa to say, can you find people who supply medicines? They bring them here and you consign them. Pure corruption. Even when that deal was so bad, it was so bad at procurement level, it was so bad in that a lot of money was lost. But the biggest price the Zambian people paid, which we needed to focus on, and I'm saying this because this is what President Lungu would have been very worried about. How many people died? How many people have died as a result of that mismanagement, the mismanagement of the 61 containers? The real cost may not be the $60 million that we should be talking about, but how many people were deprived of essential drugs and ended up dying because some people in the Ministry of Health under the UPND decided that they benefit from this particular transaction and mishandled it deliberately so that it became difficult to account. Zambians needed to interrogate. How possible is it that 61 containers can be imported and just dumped at some yard? What was in that 61 containers? Were those medicines, the efficacy of those medicines that were there? For all we care, they could have had questionable expiry dates. Or maybe those medicines were close to their expiry dates. That is the reason why somebody deliberately dumped them, for fear that once they distribute them, the scandal will be exposed. There may be more to it than meets the eye. It's not only the money that was spent. Everything about that transaction is questionable. Because the containers were in Lusaka. I speak as a member of parliament. President Lungu had guided us to take parliament to task, to wonder why the levels of medicines in hospitals was very low. And Madam Speaker was persuaded. She constituted a committee that looked at well over 100 health facilities across the country and came with a report on the floor of the House. Even when the report that was shared by a UPND chairperson for health, Dr. Kalila, showed that there was a critical shortage of medicine across the country, our friends in the UPND argued. And President Lungu was dismayed by that because the report was clear. The chairperson of that committee was their own member, and yet they argued. Even after arguing with that, there were 61 containers somewhere in Lusaka. One would wonder, why were they not quickened at that level? At that point, they should have been quickened to ensure that those medicines were distributed. Even when the shortages were indicating in the reports, the 61 containers still remained stored. That is a question. Zambians, let's go a little further. Why wasn't the EPND government in a hurry to distribute the medicines in the 61 containers, even when the reports were showing that there was a critical shortage? Yeah, so President Lungu died a very sad person, knowing that Zambians are dying from preventable diseases. They are dying because there's no medicines in hospitals. And there's no medicines in hospitals purely because of corruption and theft. And yet the angels that called President Lungu a thief, his ministers a thief, are the ones who are at the helm of these corruption scandals, as it were. Yeah, so really I think we miss President Lungu's leadership. President Lungu with traditional leaders, like traditional leaders in Luapula. If President Lungu was given a chance to leave, President Lungu would have worked with the chiefs in Luapula to ensure that Sujilite worked for the people of Luapula. The poverty levels in Luapula are high, and when it was discovered that God, the mighty God, put something in Luapula, Sujilite and manganese, in his usual style, President Lungu would have sat with the traditional leaders to ensure that these resources actually worked for the people there. Today, we don't even know where that Sujilite is. In one statement, there are containers of Sujilites that have been impounded. The Sujilite mine is closed and is being guarded by soldiers. The next moment, those two containers are nowhere to be seen. The next moment, you are told, no, the Sujilite is finished. Then you ask questions. Who was mining? We thought these areas were being guarded so that no one should mine until government puts up proper regulations. We were wrong. President Lungu, we were wrong. The mining activities continued in those areas. That Sujilite, which was impounded in those two containers, is also gone. And the people of Luapula still remain poor. The farmers there still remain sharing fertilizers in Medas. The road from Serenje via Tuta is still very bad, but could have benefited from these minerals like Sujilite. The people in many areas there, Chifunabuli, and many other parts of Luapula, Milenge, still yearn for roads, which roads could easily have been constructed had that Sujilite been properly used. But I thank God that President Lungu, before you died, in consultation with the chiefs, the 6 million hectares of land, which was about to be stolen by the colleagues in the UPND, fronting a poor Vietnamese, calling him an investor, that was stopped. We thank God that that was done, and that going forward, when Zambian people give us a chance to govern again, we will revisit all those, the Sujilite mines, President Lungu. We will make sure that we visit the resource that is in Luapula to use it properly for the people of Luapula. Go well, President Lungu. You've made such a mark in my life. My political life, the entire life is wholly owed to you. My family and I shall forever remain indebted to you for this political journey. You adopted me at very short notice when you discovered I was popular in Mporokoso, even when I did not apply. You literally asked me to apply and gave me an adoption certificate because you said my name was popular there. You immediately made me Minister of Northern Province. Later made me Government Chief Whip. You later, when we lost elections, appointed me as Leader of Opposition. Whilst I was serving as a Minister and Government Chief Whip, you exposed me to politics by appointing me as campaign chairperson, campaign manager. I started with Chumba and Musoa by-elections. These were ward by-elections in 2017. I proceeded as campaign manager for the Lunte chairperson. You later appointed me as campaign manager for the Lupososhi chairperson. I was later to be campaign manager in Chilubi. I later was campaign manager in Lukasha and went back again to Chilubi for council chairperson. This exposure, Your Excellency the President, I shall forever cherish. And as I said, my family and I shall forever remain indebted to you, Your Excellency the President, Edgar Chagwa Lungu, for all the support that I received from you. At Central Committee level, you made me chairperson of the Legal Committee, even when I was not the most senior-most lawyer in the party. You asked me to chair the Disciplinary Committee. You asked me to chair a number of ad hoc committees that were coming up, including the Kasenseri Gold in Northwestern Province, the elections in Lusaka, the petitions after 2021. For all this, Your Excellency, I am indebted to you. I thank you very much. I thank God for the life that I shared with you, and for God for allowing me to share this life, a illustrious life, with President Edgar Chagwa Lungu. The experiences that I got from there, I shall forever use them for the betterment of others in society. I thank you.